Hello, everybody. Today we are going to talk about American childhood as a social construct. This is Sociology of Family with Professor Mead. So our learning outcomes think per share for today. What's a social construct? Why is childhood considered a social construct? And how are children seen in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th century? And what are some of the differences between working and middle class families in the 20th century? So the first thing we want to talk about is what is a social construction, right? We need to understand that. So in the 60s, Berger and this guy Luckman wrote a book, and they talk about essentially this concept of habitualization. So society is created by humans through everyday interaction, right? The symbolic interaction perspective. And they say, and I quote, any action that is repeated frequently becomes cast into pattern, which can then be performed again in the future in the same manner and with the same economical effort. So not only do we essentially create our own society, but we accept our society because others have created that society for us. It existed before we were born, and it'll continue to exist after we are gone, right? So a social construction is a concept that we agree to be real and therefore becomes real in its consequences, which means that um, a concept like childhood is going to change over time. It's going to change place to place, and it's even going to change based on social location, like social class and race and experiences. But you tend to have a general consensus within a society. So let's talk about childhood as a social construct. How do we know it's a social construct? Well, the book and the article talks about it as changing over time. This author is making the assumption that you understand the social construction of reality, what a social construct is. And so they're kind of laying out the evidence for you in terms of why childhood itself is a social construction, this concept. So they talk about how in the 17th century, the concept of childhood, age wasn't as important. You thought of your baby as, your infant as any child that's really under 5 or 6 years old. You could be considered a child until you were 10 or until you were in your 20s. So it was also believed, because we're looking at it historically, we don't know if this is true. There's some contradictory evidence, but it was also believed that adults were less likely to sentimentalize children. They thought that because people had more children and more children passed away, and because of pictures that we've seen in terms of how they dress children like little adults, that we as adults would have been less sentimental for each one of our children. There's evidence against that today. We do some of the same behavior, even though we sentimentalize our children now. They were largely thought of as adults in training, right? So a lot of times children were treated as though they had all of the logic and capacity for understanding as adults. They just needed to be trained in morally correct ways, right? Because in terms of socializing, that's how we thought of it often. So in the early 18th century, right, so as we see childhood socially constructed over time continue to change, you start to see separate stages and this idea that there are different stages: infancy, toddlerhood, youth, adolescence, and that children needed more protection based on those different stages of life. Like an infant needs more protection than a toddler. A toddler needs more protection than a youth. And instead of seeing children as inherently immoral and needing to be changed to moral or socialized into moral, childhood started to be seen as, or children started to be seen as born innocent, and that type of innocent and playfulness was a natural thing as opposed to the other way around, that you more needed to protect innocence instead of correcting bad behavior. And then at the same time, you see parents change their perspective, right? So now I need to protect children. Those children are in a separate stage of life, and they're more innocent than adults, and they're more fragile than adults. So you see that change. And as we see the article, Mintz continue to talk about childhood. He goes into the 19th century. And you start to see a lot of like these books from psychologists come out, and they talk about prescriptive stages. And so you start to see them talk about these different stages. You probably learned in Intro to Soc those different stages, or Intro to Psychology. And that they divided childhood up into those stages. And we started to organize our education system and organize activities for children based on those prescriptive stages. At the same time, you saw a birth rate decrease. So people have less children overall, the demographics of people. And you start to see more distinct generations appear. When people were having children from their early 20s into their late 40s and even 50s, you would still have children at home who were young, and have adult children who had already left the home. And so those generations blurred together. But as people had less children, their grouping of children would grow up, and you would start to have more connections to your brothers and sisters, or your parents and grandparents, and you saw them as distinct stages because they didn't end up blending together or spanning a huge time frame. Now we kind of go into childhood as socially constructed, not just over time, but through social location. And this is another reason why we know childhood is a social construct, because even in the 20th century, depending on your social class, and your social location, you're going to have a different childhood. In the early 20th century, you start to see children, middle-class children, have longer childhoods overall, and then prescriptively less responsibilities. They weren't going to work anymore. They were maybe only responsible for going to school. They didn't have to contribute to the family's income. They may have had chores, but not as many. So they had less and less responsibilities. While urban and working class children still had to contribute to their family's economic well-being. And depending on your social class, that could have been anything from selling newspapers to scavenging for coal and wood and those kinds of things. And then if you lived in a rural area, of course, rural farming children would put in a lot more time and effort into being on the farm, doing work on the farm to help the family succeed in terms of their farm. And not only did schooling vary by class, but it also varied by sex considerably, sex and race, right? So at this time, really, young white boys are the only ones getting an education. The types of education middle class white girls would get would be more like sewing and homemaking and that kind of stuff. And then you also start to see a new portion of childhood that didn't exist previously. Previous to this time, there was no real concept of adolescence. Now, adolescence, today can almost be described as kind of a limbo period between childhood and adulthood. You're not quite a child, but you're not an adult yet. But it was in the early 20th century that this concept was invented of adolescence. And parents, again, were increasingly concerned with child rearing. And you have lots of books come out about that. You have people reading books about child rearing when they're pregnant, that kind of thing. You have a lot of psychologists, giving directions for how to raise children coinciding with those prescriptive stages. And this is really when we cement the idea of, protecting the innocence of your children and insulating them from other people or situations or events that can quote unquote corrupt them and change them from innocence to adulthood, right? And then you also have at the same time, the birth rates are still falling. Now we're not having 6 or 7 children, we're having 2 or 3. Adolescence, even till today, has continued to extend. Later in the late 20th century, it's going to be into the late teens. Today, it's probably the early 20s. And at the same time, in the late 20th century, you see children definitely become independent consumers. You see the marketing towards them, and they become a consumer all of their own. And then the idea of childhood, or the idea that we have in our modern society, is really one that kind of came about in the 1950s, because our current ideas of childhood are more of a postmodern childhood. Anytime you say postmodern, it just means new. So new childhood, right? The new modern childhood. And so some of the reasons why we have this is because of some radical changes that we have within our society since the 1950s. We have the idea or the concept of family has changed considerably. Gender expectations have changed considerably. What is age appropriate, or what your age means in terms of your link to childhood or adulthood has changed. And then even sexuality and reproduction, not only are we having less children, but our sexuality is continuing to change, how we meet, enter the marriage market, marry, and have children. Okay, working class and middle class parents. So I have your working class versus middle class parents, right? So we're talking about childhood as a social construction again, right? So this is literally class distinctions because childhood is seen differently. The social construction of childhood is seen differently based on your class. So working class parents are more likely to see childhood as a natural development. They're the parents that are going to let you kind of go ride your bike and hang out on the weekends and hang out with your friends. But they also are the parents that are going to have stricter rules, have more expectations on you for obeying authority if you're the child, right? So it's the do as I say because I'm your parent, be home on time because that's when the bell rings, that's that type of, expectation. Middle class parents, however, are more likely to see their children as needing active stimulation. So they're going to be the one to involve you in all of these, involve the child in all kinds of regulated sports or, different types of activities, taking additional, classes outside or sports activities outside of your school. Or if you don't have an activity, taking you to do something to Disneyland to entertain the child, that type of thing. And they're more likely to also be organizing and supervising activities that they think will push skill development and give their child the edge in the middle class economy. They will also be more likely to host like a kind of supervised activity party versus a hang out and get in the jumper and eat what you want party. One of the reasons why academics think that there's a difference here is because working class parents, like say for example, be home on time, do as I say, don't question me, that's going to set you up to be an employee in the economy we face today where you have to be on time. You're not really allowed to question authority. You're not allowed to have your opinion, right? Versus middle class parents are expecting their children to have more control or organizational authority when they become adults. So what this is called, I'm going to start here on this side. I don't know if you can see, but I'm going to start in the middle. So what this is called is concerted cultivation and natural growth. So middle class parents are more likely to raise their children in what we would call concerted cultivation. So they are trying to actively enhance children's talents, opinions, and skills. whereas poor and working class parents are more likely to do what we call natural growth, which is I'm going to provide a safe and loving environment, letting children grow on their own, right? So that's kind of the idea. Those are basically the modern terms we have had. More like older terms, they've switched into that, right? So if you look on the left, social class and parental values, this is how we used to talk about it. And it seems to have maybe a judgmental kind of tone to it. I think that's why it's changed. Middle class parents emphasize independence and self-direction. Poor and working class parents emphasize conformity and obedience to authority, right? So that's an older theory. You can see how it has that judgmental tone, whereas it's not really a new theory. It's the theory itself just brought into modern terms, and we say concerted cultivation, right? Enhance children's talents and opinions and skills. And then natural growth, where you provide a loving environment and let children grow on their own, right? So you see that kind of shift in just the way that we're wording it. By the way, the updated research is great too, because it includes things like racial groups, different educational backgrounds, and additional class backgrounds, something that was lacking in some of the older research. Here's your discussion questions again. So now could you answer these questions? What's a social construct? Why is childhood considered a social construct? How are children seen in the 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th century? And what are some of the differences between working class and middle class parents? Have a great day.